Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Masterclass from OutSystems. This masterclass is divided onto 4 separate sections. You will find a Best Practices introduction with naming conventions, coding conventions, logic and development, reusability and maintainability, JavaScript, CSS and HTML, database, security and teamwork. We will revisit these best practices under a new light with a summary of the 10 best practices to deliver better apps. We will then talk about some common pitfalls, namely circular references, assign list expression to query, binary loaded on preparation, and assign empty record list to clean. And we will end with a description of heavy timers, how to handle timers that run for a very long time in the OutSystems platform. Now let us begin with developing better applications with the OutSystems platform, the best practices. And we will start with naming conventions. We should use English for code and comments. Now this is not mandatory, obviously, but the platform will infer some data types from the English names that you give your variables, input and output parameters. And it will only do so for English names for those variables. And it will do so if you use entity or structure names in variables. So for instance, here we have a contact defined, a contact entity. If we want to have a local variable which is a contact, then we should simply name it with the same name, contact. If we do so, the platform will automatically infer the data type as being a record of the entity contact. If we want to have a list of contacts, we simply use the plural version of that name, and the platform will infer a contact list in this case. We should use also a suffix ID in variables that will be identifiers. So you can have a contact ID, which is an input parameter in this case. If we have such a name on an input parameter or a local variable, then the platform will infer a contact identifier data type. We should also prefix actions invoked by timers with timer underscore and set the name property of table records, forms, and so on. Now let me show you what is meant by setting the name property. Now I have here a demo application, a web application in platform 10, OutSystems 10, and here we have a list screen. This is a to-dos screen. So list screen, we have here a table records, and the table records has its name set. We have here the to-do table. This means that in any expression that belongs to the table records, their value is to-do table dot something. So this is an indication of where is the source of my data. If there are multiple table records on my screen, this name tells me which is the one that I'm using. The default name would be something like table records 1, which is very cryptic. And it's up to you to properly identify them because you're going to be using these names throughout your expressions here inside this table. Use proper naming for these table records, forms, and so forth so that every reference is properly identified with a name that explains properly what is the intention of that table records. This makes it easier to change your code in the future, easier to maintain. Coding conventions. Avoid empty labels, again for the same reason. Say for instance I come over to the Logic tab and open the server action, and I'm going to add a switch here, actually an if clause. And this if clause is going to say, well, if a is smaller than 1 and a is bigger than -5 and a is not a null identifier. I'm going to hit Control space to autocomplete, and that's it. So this is the expression that's here. I can see the label automatically set by the platform. However, it's much more interesting if I just give it a proper description, a proper name here on the label, so that it properly describes my intention. So I'm going to say, is a not null and between -4 and 0, because I'm not using less than equal to or greater than or equal to. And that's it. So is a not null and between -4 and 0. This is much more interesting, much more easy to read than the expression that was there. And because this is formed as a question, it's very easy for me to follow the false or true paths from this if. The same thing could be said here for this assignment. I'm assigning the completed date to the current date, and I can just say that right here. So completed date equals today, for instance. And if I use this as a label, it's much easier to understand what is happening on this assignment, and so forth for all nodes or statements that are defined here in this action. Avoid empty labels. Labels help you document your code, make it easier for you to understand what you're typing, what you're using in the platform. It makes it easier then, later on, to maintain your code, to debug your code by yourself, by your colleagues. It avoids errors because it's easier to understand. There are less bugs, less time debugging, and so forth. There are lots and lots of advantages in properly naming things, properly documenting things in your own code. We're going to repeat this throughout this presentation. It is a good practice in the OutSystems platform, just the same as it is in any computer programming language. So again, we are reinforcing the idea by having the best practice to comment unclear or complex logic. Now I'm sure that you've seen our comment widget. Here you have one, and you just drag this to any node to assign it to a particular node, and you write your comment there. This is how you comment unclear or complex logic. You should set the example string of expressions. Now, if we go over to the to-dos list screen, we can see that in an expression that is very simple and simply includes, for instance, a name, an attribute of the aggregate that is associated with the table records that fetches data for this entire table, and including this expression, such as is happening here, then the platform can very easily use that aggregate to fetch the first row on the actual real live database and use data that's there to provide examples that you see here on the canvas. Now, when I say the platform can do this, in particular, I'm referring to Service Studio, which I have open here. Now, when you start having more complex expressions, for instance, you may want to add a letter at the end of your, or a character at the end of your name. The platform is still smart enough to understand that. But some expressions, such as substring and I'm going to just fetch the first character. Some expressions won't allow the platform to actually understand what is your intention. When that happens, either only expression shows up here or the wrong preview shows up. In this situation, you go over to the example property and you provide a proper example for your data. Why is this important? Again, to ensure there are less bugs and less mistakes. You are seeing exactly a preview of real live data, accurate data, on your canvas, so you can better figure out when, wait a minute, there's not enough screen room for what I'm trying to display here, or this is an email and because there's not enough room it breaks in the wrong places. I don't want emails to break. Or I was assuming this would show up in a single line, but because there isn't enough room, because this is a name of a user and there's two names to his name, it will break and have the first name here and last name underneath it. So I prefer to use an expression here so that I only get his first name and things like that. Because you're seeing the actual data, you can trap real live errors from your development environment faster, ensuring better results faster. Use static entities instead of hard-coded values. Take a look at this example. We have here an assignment, which is assigning the string, the text, new to contact status. This means that status has to be a text as well. If we take a look at this, we can probably infer that, okay, maybe status means something like whether this contact is new, is being modified, whether it's being approved or rejected, and things like that. So those are the valid strings that can be assigned to status. But say that in one of your assignments, by mistake, you type new with an uppercase E. Then, elsewhere in your code, when your aggregates are looking for new contacts, the filter won't find the contacts that are created using that part of your code. It's a silent bug that will be there until somebody finally realizes that in some circumstances new contacts somehow disappear and are not processed by another part of your application. So how can you do this in a better way? You can actually create a static entity. In those static entities, you define which are the records that are available in that entity, in this case, new and approved. And now you can change your contact entity. Change status to be a reference to one of these records, and therefore it will be a status identifier. So you want a status ID name to this attribute, so that it is a status identifier following the best practices of the platform. And in this situation, you simply assign it one of the records by going over to entities, dot, and then the name of your static entity, in this case status, and then dot, and the name of one of your records, in this case new. The great advantage here, of course, is that any such bugs are caught early on. You can't assign a new with an uppercase E. The platform won't allow you to do that. There is no such dot new with an uppercase E. Your filters will work properly. Furthermore, your entity will be smaller and faster. A string, a text field here, will actually take up more room for this new string than an ID, which is a number, an integer. An ID is also indexed, and unless you remember to index this attribute here specifically, this means that searches and filters on this attribute will be faster. There are lots and lots of advantages in using static entities. This is the best practice that you have on using constant-like values in your code. Yet another advantage. Say that elsewhere, besides status, you have something like if this contact is a male or female. Let's take that as an example. And you may want to use the string male and the string female. And by mistake, if you're using this kind of pattern, you might end up mistakenly writing onto status the string male, or vice versa, writing onto gender the string new. The platform won't know that such an assignment is an error. Whereas if you're using this kind of pattern, then status ID can only be assigned records from the status static entity. If you have a gender ID attribute, it can only be assigned records of the gender static entity. And if you try to mix them up by mistake, the platform will catch that and inform you of the bug. So again, this is a huge advantage. You should be using static entities instead of hard-coded values. Finally, you should use just the common pattern and common conventions that are used throughout our examples and throughout everybody that is developing with OutSystems, which is to use the upper camel case, also known as Pascal case, when naming your actions, entities, variables, input and output parameters, and so forth. You should also keep your flows vertical and tidy. Now take this example. At first glance it looks pretty tidy. Everything is pretty much aligned vertically and horizontally. But let's try and follow the flow. Now we start here and have an if at this position. If it's false, it goes to the assignment and then falls back to the common flow. This is normal practice, so this is fine. We have another if here, but now it can go either left or to the bottom. So you're not repeating what's happening here, which is right and down. Here it's left and down. And if it goes left, we actually zigzag an end. This is actually one of the possibilities of ending this action. And it's not obvious at first glance because it's not one of these green symbols, which are the most common ones. And so it takes you a few seconds to realize, oh, this is one of the ways to finish this action. And the other path is through here. You are also zigzagging and you end in this location. So this is much harder to figure out than something that would be a bit more tidy, such as this option here. As you can see, we have a vertical flow. This is the main flow of my action. This is where I would expect the action to process or to progress through the nodes or statements until it reaches the end. There are a couple of exceptions because there are a couple of ifs here, and the arrows tell me where they can go, so to the right and back to the main flow, or to the right and it doesn't come back to the main flow, so I just keep adding stuff to the right, and this is another possibility of ending. So this is much easier to understand at a glance. The advantage here is for a shorter time to understand what is being expressed when you're writing it. This is a small example with just a few nodes, but say you have an action that has something like 50 nodes, and then you have a problem if you're writing it in this way. It's very hard to figure out what's going on. You're going to spend tens of minutes trying to understand what is going on before finally trying to tackle the bug you're trying to solve or something like that. Whereas if it's very tidy, very well grouped together, then it's much easier to understand. Now, you can break these rules anytime you see fit. If it's a vertical here, and here it's horizontal, you can break the rule if, for instance, this branch is much longer. If it's much longer, it doesn't make sense to keep going horizontally. Maybe you should, for instance, have one node here, and then the other ones also follow towards the vertical direction, downwards. Or, my personal favorite, to have two branches coming off here, both diagonally, one in this direction, the other one in this direction, and then from these nodes the code follows downwards vertically and symmetrically in both sides. Of course, if there are more ifs in the middle of that, you need to make decisions on how you want to keep things tidy and organized. Always create exceptions where they aid clarity, but try and keep the flows vertical in the vast majority of time. That is how you expect to read things when you find an action. Logic and development. Remove unused or duplicated code. Now you do have find usages which help you find all the usages of a particular element in your code, in your actions, and you can figure out whether a specific action is not being used in your code. And in fact, in OutSystems 10, we also have a module and remove unused elements. If you click here, then all of your elements which you're not using and dependencies you're not using will be cleared from this module, and this is automatic. Reuse logic with user actions. Now, I should point out the difference between user actions and screen actions. User actions are the actions you find here in logic. These can be reused throughout your code. When you have actions inside a screen, such as these ones here, then they are called screen actions. They can only be used from this screen and from nowhere else. This means that these are reusable, and these should therefore contain reusable code to be used elsewhere in your module. You should reuse actions with user actions. And one example, of course, is to encapsulate data formatting with user functions. Now, what is a user function? It is the same thing as a user action, except that you've set this property, function, to yes. Now, once we do that, we need to have an output parameter, and of course, the platform can do that on its own actually, to help me out. So I have now an output parameter. But the advantage is that now that this is a function, I can use it anywhere where an expression needs to be used. So let me show you, for instance, on the interface, going back to the to-do screen, which is this one here. If I go back to this expression, oh, this is actually the link. Let me try and find expression. Here we go. And I go over to values. So I'm going to set, what was the name? Click set to do complete date. So set to do. And I can even hit control space for an autocomplete, control space. And it will autocomplete with my actual function that I have defined here. It knows that it has an input which is called to-do ID. It's mandatory, what is the data type, and so forth. If I set a description, it will show up here. So my action is automatically defined. If I click here on this action, there is a description property. So once you set this, automatically you have documentation for your function. And so this can be reused anywhere where you have an expression, where you can have an expression in your module. You should also be careful about infinite recursion. Now, this is a recommendation in any programming language. The common Stack Overflow error is the result on other programming languages, and something similar happens in OutSystems. You should also set at least one default button in your web screens. Now let's go over to the interface, the to-do detail. Now here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons. One of them has a different color. And it has a different color because its default is set to yes. If I set another button to be the default, then the color changes. And of course, the other buttons, if any of them are default, they're set to no. Only one button can be the default. And what is the default button? Well, browsers by default, this is the default behavior which can only be adjusted with JavaScript. Whenever you're typing with your keyboard on an input element, if you hit the Enter key, the browser will trigger your default button, which in this case is this one here. So, power users typically use the Enter key and other keyboard shortcuts to speed up their work, which means that you should pay attention to what should be expected by a user when it hits the Enter key. So think about it. We are editing, for instance, creating a new to-do. I type the title, set the user, set some notes, and I hit Enter. What am I expecting to happen? Now, actually, this is a small exception. This is a multi-line note field, so Enter here simply breaks the line. But if I'm typing elsewhere, here or here, if I hit Enter, the browser will attempt to trigger the default button. What do I expect? Now, it's likely that I expect the form to save, what I've just typed to be saved, which is why this was initially my default button. If, for instance, you have an entire screen that simply tries to confirm whether you are sure you want to delete something, then you might want to have the reverse logic. Even though the default is yes, of course, that I want to delete it, if you have a special screen to warn you about it, then it's something that's very sensitive, very important, and maybe you can't go back on. So in that situation, you might want to have your default to be the save button, so cancel. This forces your user to hit the tab key to move focus to the delete or to the OK button, and then hit Enter to apply that button. So the default button is a usability best practice. You should set it on every screen because browsers will try to apply it on every screen. We'll try to add that functionality. Now, another example is the to-dos list screen. We have only one input here. Say the user is typing here and hits Enter. What do you think should be the default behavior? What does the user expect? Well, if the user is typing a search field, it's likely that he wants to apply that search, that filter. So this should be the default button. And that's what's happening here. This is a default. And this one here is actually not a default. We simply have a special style class added to it so that it looks like a default button. Logic and development. You should hide warnings only for a good reason. Now, warnings in the platform can be hidden. This is the place, the true change pane, where errors and warnings show up. And you can hide warnings. I can click on a warning, right-click, and I have the option to hide warning. Now, only hide them for a good reason. What is the good reason? Say, for instance, you haven't filled in a specific property from your table records or aggregate or something like that. So I'm using a specific default. Make sure you know what you're doing. This is not a verbatim citation of the actual text message, warning message, but you understand what I mean. If you have this kind of warnings, this is a default. Are you sure? Well, if you are sure, if that's what is your intention, then go ahead and hide it. That is the purpose of hiding. The purpose of hiding is not to, oh, I don't like to see this here, I'm going to hide it. If you hide it, you might forget to come back and see what's hidden. And you may forget to fix a particular warning. So if this is something that you want to fix later on, leave it here. If this is something that you no is correct, is exactly what you want to happen at this moment, go ahead and hide it. Of course, unused elements means that you still need to do something, or you either need to delete the element because it's not being used, or you're expecting to use it eventually. In either situation, there's more work that needs to be done, so I would leave these here. Deprecated properties and deprecated warnings are also something that needs to be addressed eventually. You need to change things for the new way of working, and therefore you should pay attention to these, and these should not be hidden. So hide warnings only for a good reason. Avoid changing site property values in your logic. Now, site properties are found in the Data tab. You have here your site properties, and they exist as configurable constants in your code. So you can come here and you can change their default value. Note that it doesn't say here value, but rather default value. You can change their actual value whenever you install this module on a server using Service Center. So you don't need to recompile them to change these properties. And this is what they are meant for. So whenever you create an extension and you communicate, you consume a web service, the actual URL that you're using for that web service can be changed in Service Center, I apologize. Whenever you have an external database, the connection information is available in Service Center for you to change, and these site properties are also available in Service Center for you to change. So they're meant as configurable constants, and I use the expression constants because they're not meant to be changed. However, they are not actually constants, and you can change them using specific code in the platform. However, if you change them, this will require the platform to force the flushing of some caches. It will take a while for the application to be responsive again. It's therefore a very slow, time-consuming process, which should be avoided. If you want to store information for your session, store it in session variables instead, or in your entities. Try not to use your site properties. Avoid long-running timers. Now, at the end of this presentation, the last section is about heavy timers, which are simply long-running timers. We will be talking about them. Why should you not have long-running timers when that section comes along? You should avoid them. There are techniques to change the code of long-running timers into something that will be better handled in the platform. Not because there is some sort of platform limitation, but because they will behave better. It's a better practice overall to change the way such long-running timers work. Place as little information as possible in session. Now, I've just shown you the session variables. They're also found in the Data tab, and they're right here. Now, in order to support multiple front-end servers, all sharing the same back-end database server, which is a common configuration on an OutSystems environment, then you need to load session variables every time a new screen is accessed from a browser. And even before the preparation can start to run, you need to load the session variables from the database into memory. Then the preparation can run, and this renders the HTML which describes the screen. And after that is ready, that has finished running, these session variables are saved back to the database using an update statement on the database. And of course, while this happens, the actual HTML that was generated is also sent over the network to the browser. Now, because there's communication to the database server every time a screen is accessed, so that there are as little as possible amount of data in these variables. So their number should be small. You should not have hundreds of session variables around here. And the amount of data in each of them should also be small. So no long text strings, no binaries here, and so forth, or lists or records and so forth. Because the bigger the data, the longer it takes to retrieve from the data, and the longer it takes to update back to the main database. So place as little information as possible in session. Whenever possible, use your entities to store information. Reusability and maintainability. Now, reuse screen parts with web blocks. Now, I'm sure you've seen this. In your flows, you can create web blocks. And web blocks are simply minute screens, small screens, or they resemble small screens, which you can insert onto a real actual screen. So I have here my web block 1. If I open my to-do screen, I can drag my web block anywhere I want it to and drop it here. And here we go. Here is my main flow web block 1. Now, this is how you reuse screen parts. So you can have on your web blocks buttons or a common set of widgets for some sort of input area, which is common for suppliers and clients and customers, or something like that. So everything that's similar from one screen to the next, you'd place on a web block so that you can reuse it from one to the other. Web blocks can also be used to share JavaScript or CSS between multiple screens. They have these two properties, JavaScript and style sheet, which when you drag over to a screen means that whatever you wrote here, if I double click on JavaScript, I have the JavaScript editor open. If I double click on style sheet, I have the style sheet editor open. And everything that you write here will actually be placed onto independent files which are referenced by the HTML that is generated on the screen that you're using your web block from. So this means that the browser will cache those files after the first use, and means that all other screens that use those files will, from that moment on, and even the same screen, from that moment on, load much faster because the browser will use the cached version it has locally rather than fetching it from the network again. So web blocks are meant to hold reusable code, reusable screen elements, or reusable JavaScript and or CSS. Now, web blocks need to be identified, and I'll come back to this in 1 second. Use refresh query to rerun queries. Now, in this screen example, we have here a refresh query node or statement. If you need data from your preparation in some other action, use a refresh query before trying to access that data. If you do not do that, then your screen will need to carry a view state which includes that data from the aggregate which was run in the preparation. So let's take a look here. So we have our preparation, which has an aggregate get to-dos. We have here a mark as complete. So say we want to assign a local variable, which I'm going to create. It could be var1, that's fine. And assign my var1 with something that comes from the aggregate. So I have here my preparation, get to-dos, and I'm going to get category name. So this all matches up. Category name is a string, so the expression is okay, and I'm going to hit done. And this means that my screen will need to carry data from my preparation, from the aggregate, so that it can be accessed from my mark as complete. Now, in order to solve that problem, because carrying that data, if it's lots of data, makes my screen slower, I can use a refresh query, refresh data, which refreshes my preparation query, and this means that in this spot that query is rerun, so I have access to that data again here. So this assignment no longer needs to access data that would be on the view state, and maybe the view state no longer needs to exist. So use refresh query to rerun queries. In this situation, and in some others, refresh query is also used to refresh data which needs to be then refreshed on the screen, such as when using pagination on a table records widget. JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Use web blocks for JavaScript encapsulation and reusability. Now, I've just shown you this. You can use your web blocks to provide encapsulation and reusability of JavaScript as well as CSS. Make sure your JavaScript blocks are perfectly identifiable. Now, you can have JavaScript blocks in web blocks, but also in expressions. If this is the value of one of your expressions, note that this is HTML. So I want my value to be actual HTML code. How can I do that? It's very simple. I simply set my expression to not escape content. When I do this, then I need to be careful, and this is a warning that immediately shows up about the possibility of HTML injection. When I do this, the output of this value is supposed to be HTML. The special symbols for HTML, less than, greater than, and ampersand, are no longer escaped to make them safe, and therefore all of your content is HTML. Now, if you write this HTML, that means that whatever is in the middle between script and close script is JavaScript code. So this is another way to add JavaScript to your screen. Now, we do have a special JavaScript masterclass that you can watch to understand much more details about how to work with JavaScript on the platform. But these expressions, a web block that contains JavaScript and an expression, should be identifiable. You need to see them on the canvas that you're using such an expression. So how do you do that? Let's quickly try and drag here an expression and say I'm not escaping content, and I have a script something / script content. Now, if I have a long JavaScript block, I don't want to see the code here, so what do I do? In order for this to be identifiable, you use the example string. And you typically write something like my menu script, something that identifies what the script is doing. What's the advantage? On the canvas, you see the example. On the real page, the code is there just doing its thing, and this example string is not displayed. So this helps identify this expression as a script block. And how about web blocks? We're using a web block here, but we can't even see it. Let's see if we can find it on the tree widget. I'm going to click here, so probably here we go. And here it is. Main flow web block 1. but it's invisible. How do we do this for a web block? How do we make it visible and identifiable? We could write something here, my menu screen, but now the problem is that when I go back to the to-dos, even though I can't see the web block right here, when I run this page, it will also be visible here. So I don't want this. How can I have something just be displayed on the canvas? Now there is no example string in the properties of my web block, but I can use a special technique to make that happen. So I just click on my text, I right click and I enclose in if. So now my text is in the true part of an if. In that case, what I want to be displayed on screen, on the browser, is the false part. So, condition false. This is always false, so it's always the blank part that is displayed on the screen. But the previewer, the canvas, shows both options, and I can even tell it only to show the true part. And that's what I want to see on the canvas, just to display and identify my web block. Here we go. Now this screen is here, this text is here. I can see that I'm using this web block, but this text is not displayed on the web page, on the actual web page itself at all. Now there are even Silk blocks, Silk UI blocks that you can use to make this even prettier, this identification, but that is the topic for the JavaScript masterclass. Use cross-browser JavaScript. Now, browsers are moving towards normalization. The World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, publishes standards that define how the language should look like, act, and behave, how its standard library should act and behave. The DOM, the Document Object Model, should act and behave. And browsers are slowly merging these and implementing these recommendations, and they're being closer and closer together. But users still use old browsers. There are some differences in the JavaScript between these browsers, especially in the DOM and the similar functions. So you should be using a framework such as jQuery that normalizes these changes. This framework will make sure that what you express in jQuery works and is understood the exact same way everywhere. And this is one of the major advantages. The OutSystems platform makes jQuery automatically available on every screen. You don't need to specify anything new. Avoid writing custom HTML using unescaped expressions. Now, we just saw unescaped expressions. There are some good uses for them, such as JavaScript. But if you're trying to do something such as this, which is trying to make a piece of text look bold, you actually have platform buttons that do that. So if I have here my expression and I want it bold, I just go over to this button and it's bold. And the platform automatically inserts the B and /B around it. Now, this makes it completely visible that you're trying to use the bold functionality. The canvas can preview and show you how it looks like. Again, less bugs, you know what's happening immediately during development. You don't even need to launch the browser to see what's going on. So avoid using custom HTML using unescaped expressions unless you have a very good reason. Unless the platform doesn't allow you to directly do something and you just use it to do something really different or special. Avoid duplicate CSS styles. Now, this kind of styling where box div is defined twice and the second one overrides the first one, even though it's the exact same color. This is allowed by the browsers. It works fine, but it's probably the result of concatenating two different CSS styles or automatically generating them using tools such as Less or Sass. Now, this should be avoided, obviously. It's being duplicate. There are too many characters. It takes slightly longer to download, slightly longer to parse by the browser because there are more characters, and it doesn't make any sense. Avoid them. Keep your CSS styles tidy. And whenever possible, minify JavaScript and CSS. Database. Build for change. Prefer aggregates. They are easy to maintain. They are database independent. They are optimized by platform. Aggregates describe actually your intention to fetch data from a database. You don't write any code. You don't write any SQL code, any SQL expressions on an aggregate. This means that the platform takes what you described on the aggregate as your intentions and converts them to the actual SQL code that is required to apply such intentions. And the actual SQL code is different from one database to the next. In MySQL, it can be one thing, in Oracle slightly different, in Microsoft SQL Server even something different, more different. So you basically have database independence by using aggregates. Not only that, the platform also knows which are the best techniques to express and retrieve data using optimized SQL statements. And that know-how is built into the platform and is applied to your code without you having to do anything and learn anything about your new databases. This means that if you change your underlying database from Microsoft SQL Server to Oracle, from Oracle to MySQL, from MySQL to Microsoft SQL Server, whichever changes you make, none of your aggregates need to be changed. Furthermore, say that you have three environments, three OutSystems environments, which we typically demo as the development environment, then the QA or quality assurance environment, and the production environment, where your clients, your customers, are using your apps live. Now, for costs control, you could have a MySQL database in your development environment. And only on your QA and production environments do you have Microsoft SQL Server. If you want to do that, this is possible, and as your modules migrate from the development environment to the QA environment, they actually don't need to be changed at all. If you don't use SQL nodes, then your aggregates keep working on the QA environment. However, remember that the suggestion I just gave is bad if, of course, you want to have advanced SQL or just SQL nodes, because those will be run exactly as you type them, and you probably have different nuances of SQL dialect for MySQL and for Microsoft SQL Server. And this would prevent you from developing stuff that would work properly in QA and production. So aggregates are the preferred way to fetch information. And of course, you have the built-in actions, entity actions, to update information. So we have here entities, such as the category entity, and we can see here the default actions that are created. Create category, create or update category, update category. Get, which is automatic, when you want to use this on an expression, get category for update, and delete category. Now to change your category, you'd use one of these 5. The sixth one actually doesn't make any changes. But there are exceptions. Now all of these have a limitation. They only make changes to a single row on each call. So here you have this source that you want to create and returns the ID of the row that was created. Again, here to update, you just provide the source, and inside the source you have the ID. And to delete, you provide the ID, and that row is deleted. So there's no way to delete multiple rows. In order to do that, you should find all their IDs using an aggregate and then iterate those IDs and perform delete to all those rows. Unfortunately, the delete, what it will do is generate a delete SQL statement that it will send to the database, and this means that there will be multiple calls to your database. So this is not very good, not very performant. So in that particular instance, in that particular situation, the recommended way to update your database is to use a SQL node. Use SQL nodes only when the operations are not supported by aggregates or by the built-in update functions. For instance, to do bulk operations. Now you can see here a bulk operation. I'm deleting from the user entity a user where I'm identifying it by a means other than its ID. Because it's not an ID, there is the potential for multiple rows to be selected. Now this is one single SQL command which is sent to the database, and the database will delete all rows. If you use the previous technique of finding all rows with an aggregate and then using the delete action to delete each row at a time, then multiple delete SQL commands would need to be sent to the database server, which is much slower. So the recommendation, the best practice when deleting, when updating, or inserting multiple rows is to use a SQL node. Now it has a disadvantage. You'll be using whatever syntax you prefer, but it won't be automatically updated to a new database engine when you are changing your underlying database, DBMS, your database management system. Also, you should use parameters in SQL instead of hard-coded values. So here, for instance, instead of saying isActive equals 0, you would create an input parameter in your SQL node, place the input parameter here, and when calling the SQL node, you would provide that input parameter and assign it either to 0 or to a static entity that had the same meaning as this 0. Performance. Index your entities. Now, the primary key of a database table is automatically indexed. To put this in OutSystems terms, on an entity, its identifier, which will automatically be a primary key, is automatically indexed, which means that finding rows based on an ID is a very fast operation. If, however, you perform searches by any other attribute frequently, then you should make that attribute also indexed. Now remember that for any index that you add to an entity, the entity becomes slower when you are inserting new rows or updating existing rows. This is a database limitation, so you need to balance the number of indexes you create with the actual usage. This is something that is specific to database optimization. It's an optimization you would do on any computer language, any computing system. And it simply also applies to the OutSystems platform as well. So how do you do that? Well, when we click on an entity name, we have here a More. Double-clicking on the More brings us this property pane where we have here the attributes, we have indexes, which we want right now, example record, advanced. We have here even more options. And the one that's interesting is here, label, plural. This is handy when the platform doesn't properly provide a plural name for your entity name, because it will use this plural label as a reference when scaffolding things such as list screens. So on my indexes, I want to create a new index. Now I don't have the ability to do so because this is actually imported from another module, so I'm going to just very quickly create a new entity. I'm going to call it int and create a new attribute, which would be the address and then maybe even the email. And going back here, I have my More, and on the Indexes tab, I now have available my New button. And here is where I can create indexes. This is converted into actual commands that create these indexes in the database itself. So I'm creating an index. The name is not terribly relevant. It just helps me identifying one index to the next. But it's not used by the rest of my code anywhere. And I define which attributes belong to the index. So if I want to say that I often search my entity by email, then I probably want to index my email, and that's it. The common practice is to call it something like this, index email. And this makes my email attribute indexed, making searches on this attribute much faster. I have other options that are described in other training sections for the OutSystems platform, such as the unique attribute, where if you say yes, this ensures that this column, this email attribute, is unique across all rows. And you do that by creating an index such as this one. This may be something that you're interested in. It might not be, depending on your needs. Now I'm going to disable this. What you can also realize is that you can still add more attributes. And why is this? Well, if you are usually searching on this entity, always using a specific set of attributes, for instance, every time you search on this entity rather than the ID, you're searching if the address equals something and email equals something. If this is your filter in your aggregates, then you should create an index which includes both attributes, rather than creating separate indexes for each. This will make searches, such as that one, much faster. This is a compound index. It's available on databases, and the platform allows you to create such indexes in this fashion. You should also, in terms of performance, isolate large text and binary data in a separated entity. Now, this is done, let's see here. For instance, say that, and this is true, resource and resource type. Actually, resource type here is actually a static entity, so I'm going to use resource binary. And this table, this entity, will hold additional information. So I have here on this resource ID, type ID, file name, I'm typing binary content, but I want to have an additional binary content. Let's say, for instance, this is the compressed or encrypted version of my binary content. So I'm going to add an attribute, there's an ID, and there's the compressed binary content. And it holds binary data, the platform understood that. And by default, my ID is simply long integer. That's not what I want. Because this entity holds data that extends records in this entity, the ID here should be the same as this one. So if I just rename it, resource ID, this solves the issue. The data type, as you can see, was changed to resource identifier, and this makes this ID the exact same as the matching row, matching record on this entity here. What's the advantage? Well, typically large data should not be on the same main entity as the remaining information. And this is because of database performance considerations and recommendations. And by decoupling large data from the remaining information, you make the remaining information much faster to find, much easier to find, much faster to be worked with, to be backed up and everything else. Now you need to keep these two connected. Say if this holds compressed binary content for a specific row, then supposedly the main row exists here. So what happens if I, in my code, delete a row from the resource? Well, you specify it in this ID in the delete rule. Well, and three things can happen. You can protect. This means that no way. If there's still a row here with, say, a resource ID value of 5, then the corresponding row here that has an ID of 5 as well cannot be deleted. It will stay here. There will be an error if you try to delete this row when there is a corresponding record here. If you do ignore, then okay, I don't care. You can delete this one or this one, and I don't care that there are inconsistencies. If you hit delete, then this is also called a cascading delete foreign key property. And this means that this foreign key will be cascading or cascaded deleted if the main key is also deleted. So if you delete the row here that has an ID of 5, the corresponding row here with the same ID of 5 will be deleted automatically. You decide by specifying the delete rule. So you should isolate large text and binary data in a separated entity, and should make good use of the delete rules which are specified on the corresponding foreign key. More on database. Minimize the number of fields fetched from database. Now, number of fields or number of attributes or number of columns, these are all synonyms for the same thing. You should minimize the number of attributes that you are retrieving for an entity from your database. Now, if you're using aggregates to retrieve data, this is automatic actually. When we have an aggregate, let's go here over to the preparation and open this aggregate. Actually, these columns that you see here are not the columns that are fetched by the aggregate. These columns are attributes. Here you see 8 hidden columns, one hidden column, it doesn't mean that these are not retrieved and these here are retrieved by the aggregate. Quite on the contrary. What you see here is merely a preview of your data, and you hide columns or you show columns as you see fit in order to understand if the aggregate is actually showing you the data that you want to. You're trying to debug whether your sources, filters, and sorting are correct for your intentions. This is simply a data preview on your aggregate. And again, the columns that you have here have nothing to do with the actual columns that are retrieved by the aggregate. The platform knows which columns from your aggregate you're actually using elsewhere within your module. And therefore, in such circumstance, it will only retrieve from the database the actual columns, the actual attributes that you're using from this aggregate. You therefore get the absolute best case. Again, aggregates are automatic and provide you with the best solution of all to retrieve your data. However, if you're using a SQL node, then you should retrieve the columns as required per your situation, as per your case. There is, however, an exception to what I've just said. If the aggregate is placed within a user action, which we can see here in server actions, then the platform doesn't know whether this server action will be public. It can't completely figure out which are the columns that you're going to use for this action, for this aggregate, and therefore it retrieves all the columns from all the sources, from all the entities that you have defined in your aggregate. So minimize the number of fields. Again, this is obviously a database-related optimization. It is valid for any programming language and also for the OutSystems platform. It helps the database engine to only prepare internally just the right amount of information to transmit over to the application server which needs it. This reduces the amount of memory used by the database server for this particular request. It means that if there's less memory used by this request, then there will be fewer or there will be more requests available that it can handle. It will therefore be able to support more simultaneous users, and there will be less data transmitted over the internal network between the database server and the application server, and therefore this makes for a faster request. Also keep max records consistent with your needs. Now they are optimized by the platform when used with table records. Now max records are a property that you find in all aggregates. They're right here. If you leave them empty, the platform will retrieve all records, all rows pertaining to a particular aggregate. But if in your code you're actually only using the first row, for instance, and you're not iterating the remaining rows, then for instance, in that circumstance, you should set this to 1. Only retrieve the first row. Again, this has to do with database optimization for the very same reasons as I've explained here. The database server internally only needs to reserve memory to prepare to transmit one single result, the first result, rather than a set of results which can be huge. So even though you only read one, the database internally may be simultaneously preparing and keep searching for the remaining rows. For optimization's sake, it's transmitting the first one as you requested, but it keeps searching for the next ones. So it has CPU usage, it has hard disk or permanent storage usage, it has memory usage for all this, and you actually don't need it. So inform your database engine of what exactly do you need by actually setting a proper max records as defined by your needs. However, when you're using this with table records, the table records widget will internally set this to the appropriate value. Let's take a quick look at how that happens. So let me remove this. Let's go back to the interface, and here on the to-dos screen we do have a table records. Here we go. This is a table records, and table records are paginated as you see here. So if you're in the first page, it shows you the first few rows, then you hit next and this page is refreshed. We go over to the preparation again, but we see then the next 50 rows and so on. Now the way the table records does this is by adjusting its source record lists to only retrieve the right amount of rows. So if you're on the first page, it retrieves the first few rows. Let's see how many few are there. We have here a line count of 50. So in this case, our few rows means 50 rows. So the first time you come over to this page, you see the first 50 rows. So the aggregate should only retrieve the first 50 rows and max record should be 50. If you're on the second page, the aggregate should return the first page, so the first 50 rows, which table records will skip, and then the next 50, so it should return a total of 100 rows, and so forth for the remaining pages. So table records adjust this, which means that in our preparation, in our aggregate, the max records should be empty. If we do try to adjust this, even if you write a number which is seemingly correct for our table records, we get an immediate warning saying that max record should be set to actually an expression which is based on a specific function, list navigation get start index plus to the table line count plus 1. So this is the actual expression, and this expression is actually set in max records automatically. So you should actually remove this 50 and leave this empty for table records to work properly with this specific aggregate. Security. Set the screen's roles. Now, obviously, this is very easy to be forgotten, to be sidetracked into lesser priority, but remember that everything that you make available for your users on the internet needs to be protected somehow, otherwise anyone, anywhere on the planet can see it and make changes and use the application. Now, one of the first things that you can easily apply on each screen is the screen's roles. Now there is a separate masterclass on security, and there we explain with more detail the difficulties and the issues that have to do with security in the platform, and of course we also explain the very basics of setting up users and roles. But you've seen this, I'm sure, in your training, and you've used it before. As soon as you create your roles, the roles start showing up on every screen, and you can simply check the ones that apply to this particular screen. Now, obviously, anonymous is one of those that should be always disabled unless you absolutely want it and need it. Anonymous means that anyone without logging in can access that screen. Now that's useful for a public website, but it's not useful at all for any kind of client, customer, partner, or colleague of yours to be using the applications. All of those should identify themselves as such, as partners, as clients, as fellow colleagues, or an employee. They should log into the system. They would then be granted specific roles, and depending on those roles, they would be able to access specific screens, as you can see here. Now, these are simply part of the properties of a screen. As you can see here, we have the to-dos screen and only two roles actually, the anonymous and registered. These are the default roles. This is not logged in. This is logged in as anybody, really. If you had more roles, you would simply they would simply show up here, and you could just click on them, check them, or uncheck them as you see fit to protect your application. You should also validate users' roles before executing screen actions. Now, this is not mandatory. Screen actions are protected by the screen roles checkboxes, but you have a further mean here to double check on specific nuances for each screen action. Say, for instance, that an admin can delete some information even though a manager cannot. So both of them can go onto this screen. The manager will not have the delete button displayed. You need to write specific code for that. Again, we have more details in the security masterclass. But the admin can see the delete button and of course can push it. Now the delete action, screen action, should have a check for a specific role, for the CSP admin in this case role. If it has that, it needs to have that check because it's very easy for a manager to get into that screen. And even though you can't see the button, it's very easy to fake a request on the browser, which is very similar to pushing the delete button. And you therefore need to distinguish between the two in your actions. Remember to do this if you need to fine-tune the permissions of your screens. Also be aware of what is called information leaking, which is knowing where your information is traveling, whether it's on the screen, on specific widgets which happen to have a helper drop-down, search boxes that have drop-downs with autocomplete, and those may expose some information. It can be because data is exposed in the URL or in the view state. Now, security is never a closed subject. It's impossible in the IT world in general to provide you with a single set of recipe that will work for every single case and protect your application. You need to keep thinking about it and making decisions throughout your development cycle to ensure that your application is secure. More on security, you should use SSL when transmitting sensitive data, or really just always. Now you do that on screens or on flows by setting here the HTTP security and changing it from none to SSL. Now you do that of course on the screens. You have here HTTP security and SSL. You can do that also in the flows. You have HTTP security and you can set SSL or TLS. SSL is actually just the common name for the old technology, which is not the one that we support because it's been deprecated in terms of security. The current name is TLS, but in terms of marketing, SSL is the name that is known in the IT world, in the IT community. So we use both. Here is the old screenshot. We currently show the name with the full both options, SSL or TLS, Transport Layer Security. Now, if you actually visit Google, next time you visit Google and you search for a recipe on how to cook potatoes, you actually may realize that Google has switched you over automatically to SSL. So you see the HTTPS prefix on your URL. Same thing happens if you're on Facebook. You just go over to Facebook, you just type facebook.com, and you start looking at cat videos, for instance, very innocent content, and still Facebook, regardless of what you're looking at, has automatically switched you over to HTTPS. Again, this means SSL or TLS It means secure private access to Facebook. Now, SSL is a technology that encrypts data while it's being transmitted between the browser and the server, and no third parties are able to see and understand the actual data that's being transmitted. The way it works is beyond the scope, of course, of this masterclass, but you should just set it. If even the simplest and most innocent services, such as Google or Facebook, are using SSL, there is absolutely no excuse why an IT application, professional IT application such as yours, shouldn't be using it. This is very old technology. It's been around for decades now, and you should really be able to use it, as every single device, from a smartphone to the most powerful computer, supports SSL in its code. You should also use internal access only for related web flows and web services. So this means web services and web flows that require to be accessed internally only. Now, what is this internal access only that you see here? Another property of screens and flows. Internal access only you have here, or on the screen you have, or actually on a screen you don't have, you need to set it on the flow. Internal access only. Now, internal access only means that they can only be accessed internally, and this means actually in your office premises. Inside your office premises, assuming, of course, you have a local on-premises installation of the OutSystems platform. If you have the OutSystems platform on the cloud, actually you can't set this, but you can call, you can email support, and they will set up firewall rules that will make this work in a similar fashion. Now, what is it, internal access only? It is a configuration that you set during installation on your OutSystems platform setup that determines what are the IP ranges that are internal to your premises. These are usually IP ranges which don't work over the internet. They are predefined by standards bodies to only be used internally within corporations. So nobody from the outside can fake one of those addresses, or actually they can fake it, but they can send a packet over to your office from the outside pretending to be from the internal facility, but as soon as any of your devices receives that packet and tries to reply, the reply can't leave your internal premises because your internal hardware thinks that all those addresses are local only and never allows the packet to travel from outside to the outside world. So what is this good for? Now, this is good, for instance, for a service center. Service center is automatically protected as internal access only, so that only within your premises can you access service center. You can also use this for extremely sensitive parts of your application, but beware. This means that your salespeople, for instance, can't use your application when they're with a customer. Your support people can't use your applications when they're with a customer. Your fellow colleagues, other employees, can't use your applications if they're sick and they're trying to work from home. So this has limited usage and should only be applied to very sensitive material. Also remember, when using unescaped parameters and expressions, as we've seen previously, to use encode SQL, encode HTML, encode JavaScript, and even encode URL. Now, usually the platform will escape every content that you generate, but if you ask it not to escape, then you need to use these functions if you're inserting or trying to use data that comes from the outside world. Now again, our security masterclass explains this in more detail, but very quickly this means that if you have a SQL node, and in that SQL node you create a parameter, and that parameter you set as, let me just, okay, here we go, as in expanding line yes, which as you've seen the default is no. An expanding line parameter means that the parameter actually includes SQL code that you want to add to your main SQL code that you write down here. Say, for instance, you have a parameter that includes a sort order, which may be an attribute name followed by ask or desk, and things like that. So for flexibility, you have the ability to do this, to have parameters which actually include SQL code. If you have them, then they are not escaped, which means that any special characters there are going to be interpreted as special. And you need to have some attention as to SQL injection attack. We're going to take a look at that in a few minutes on a later part of our presentation today. And of course, and we've seen this on an expression that you don't have escaped, then you also need to do your own encoding. Now, in these situations, an expanding line yes input parameter on a SQL node and on unescaped expression on a screen, code injection attacks are possible. How do you protect against them? Well, the content of this variable is either text that you write, and if so, it's safe, or is text that you write having in the middle text that you received or data that you received from the outside world in terms of the server, from outside the server. So if you have data there that came from the browser, from a network service, or from anywhere else from the outside world, then somebody can fake special characters there to successfully achieve a SQL injection or an HTML injection or a JavaScript injection attack. So in those circumstances, that text that came from the outside world, either in one of these parameters or on a expression widget on a screen, you should protect it using these functions. So on a SQL node, you should use encode SQL around that particular variable that came from the outside world. On an expression, you should use encode HTML. If that expression has a script tag, as we've seen previously, and you're using the variable that came from the outside as something to be assigned to a JavaScript variable, then you should use encode JavaScript. And finally, if you're setting up your own manual URL at the destination for a link or a button, you should use encode URL. Now again, there's more information on this on the Security Masterclass. Finally, teamwork. You should use a separate individual user for each team member. Now this is obviously for security reasons, to have accountability in case you have a disgruntled employee who is starting to actually create damage in your applications. But without the security concern, more than that is to help you more quickly perform fixes in your application. Now, as you can see here, every single node, every single statement, every single widget has this kind of auditing information created by and last modified by and then a certain time and date. Now, this means simply that if you're changing something, you're changing, for instance, this action, and you don't quite get what's going on there, or if you have a strange comment assigned there saying there's a bug here that needs to be fixed, something as vague as that, then you should go over and talk to the author of that action, and you can find that out by looking at these properties that you can find here at the bottom. Here, this one was created by training, last modified by me at a certain time. So as you see, this gives you information on who to talk to in order to quickly find information and help on what's going on here in this code, understand it better, and do your changes. So use a separate individual user for each team member. Also, everyone in the team should use the same Service Studio version. This is obvious so that they don't have some odd behaviors. One of your team members is doing one thing, tells the other, okay, we can all fix this by clicking here and doing that and then merging and then doing this and that. And some people try to replicate the process and they can't, and you're all losing and wasting time simply because there's a slight difference in behavior between versions. Plan teamwork to avoid clash of screens and actions. Now, if we are going to publish, do a one-click publish, and somebody else is working on the same module, as you've seen, the merge window shows up. Unfortunately, the merge window, and I can't demo it here, unfortunately, the merge window has a minimum granularity of the action or the screen. So it can tell you you've been working on the screen and somebody else was working on the same screen. It can also show you the screens in a preview and tell you what has been changed by each of you, which widget, which parts of the screen. But you can't say, I want to keep this part of my screen and the other part of the screen that my colleague was working on. You can't do that. The minimum granularity is the screen. You select your screen or somebody else's screen. Same thing for actions. You can't say which nodes or statements inside an action you want to keep. So if two team members are working on the same screen or action, then you have a problem when you hit the merge screen. Now, this is solvable. You can simply cancel the merge, duplicate your screens or actions, then do a merge again, select the other person's screen or actions, and then manually in your module merge whatever you had on your duplicated screen or action with the ones you just imported. Delete the duplicates and publish again. Now, even though this can be done, this is something that delays your flow, delays your work, and therefore you should try and avoid the clash of screens and actions between team members. In fact, because merging takes some time, even though it's very fast, you can just assume the default that's usually correct. The platform knows what things to take from each side. Even though you're doing that, it takes some time and therefore it slows you down. If at all possible, avoid having two or more team members working on the same module at all. If that's not possible, then yes, have them work on the same module, but don't let them work on the same screen or action, as that will lead to wasted time trying to solve the merges. Finally, you should use Lifetime to perform application versioning. Now, there is a specific Lifetime masterclass at this point in time, and that one explains Lifetime in detail. Lifetime oversees all service centers in all environments. For instance, if you have those three environments, development, QA, and production, Lifetime is very easy, gives you a bird's eye view of what's installed where, and makes it very easy to move modules or entire applications, which are sets of modules, from one environment to the next. And when you change modules in one of those environments, Lifetime detects that and suggests new version numbers so that you can very easily version your work and provide your users with a consistent versioning sequence for your applications so that they know, okay, I'm now using 2.05 version and it seems that it's been recently upgraded to 2.06, so I'm assuming some things have changed in my application. They can easily see that and understand what's going on from the version numbers. To wrap up, use English and entities and structure names in variables Set labels and examples in your code and keep flows vertical and tidy. Create user actions and weblogs to encapsulate your reusable code. Prefer aggregates over SQL nodes. And be careful using roles and other security practices defined in your code. Keep them restrictive enough so that your applications are secure. 10 best practices to deliver better apps. Examples and applicability. 10 more or less. Well, best practices seem like an urban myth. Everybody talks about them, but you never see them on your projects. Well, let's bust that urban myth. Let's begin with, well, I'll use it a lot, trust me. This is an example of actually a user action, as you can see here in the actions folder, that was only meant to display and decide what to display depending on an input, which was called DAC. And it's very, very simple, it's very, very small, and actually was being used only once. If you're doing that, actually you're not reusing any code, and you spend more time placing this code here instead of just coding it where you wanted it, where you're calling this action from. So the best practice is don't abuse on modularization, especially when you only use that action once. Now here we are using the term modularization as the generic IT term of placing or restricting the scope of complexity in multiple nested modules, not in the OutSystems term of modules as equivalents of e-spaces. So don't abuse on modularization. Reuse or not reuse. In this case, we had multiple aggregates here in multiple different actions. And to reuse or not reuse, that should be a simple question. The best practice is to use a 3 strikes rule to encapsulate aggregates used in user actions. So if you do have the same aggregate being used over and over again, as you've seen on the previous slide, after you find that you're using it 3 or more times, just go over and create it on a separate user action and reuse it from there. Anything that's being used 3 times or more, you should consider at least to place it either on a separate user action or a web block for reuse. Remind what? We have here 3 comment examples, but they're way too vague. There is a bug here, so I'm bypassing postback to be changed. Well, say you and I are looking at this for the first time. There is a bug here. What bug? So I'm bypassing postback. Really? What is postback? To be changed. Changed into what? The comment isn't clear enough. Somebody spent maybe hours, maybe even days to find a bug. It was too expensive, too lengthy, too time-consuming to change it at the time, so they just left this here. There is a bug here. Now, if they spent all that time finding the bug, explain, please. It's very easy and not time-consuming at all to just write a few more sentences so that somebody who comes after you understands what's going on and does the correct change. To do, role verification is very poor. Why is it very poor? What else should be verified in terms of roles? Review when more time is available. Sure. Review into what? What should be changed? What is missing here? Again, the same thing. And of course, the same thing on the bottom comment. A bug in a line function. One is good, the other is empty, and the other is good, and the other is empty, etc., etc., etc. Okay, there is a line function in alternating lines. One works properly, whatever that means. The other is empty. Really? And why is it empty? What is the bug? What should be fixed? So this is also not enough information. Should this be fixed? Is this a problem where you found it here, where this comment is? Is this a problem from the screen, from widgets? Is this a problem from data? from the database. So again, not enough information. Reminders must explain who, when, why. Be clear on your reminders so that you understand what needs to be done, or who else comes after you understands what needs to be done. Another example. Now, where is my screen code? We have here a screenshot of Surface Studio, and it seems to be having an open screen, but the screen is empty. Or is it? We do have there an expression. It seems to have an expression that has the example set to map. Interesting. And actually, this was an actual expression, yes, that was had escape content set to false, and the expression simply called a user action. And the user action was this. And actually, in all these assign nodes that you can see here, another assign, these are all assign nodes. See here, here, another one here, another one here, here, and here, and so on. What this action was doing was manually building onto its return parameter, output parameter, HTML to be displayed. So you're actually using old school programming, creating your own HTML, inserting into the HTML variables and stuff, rather than taking advantage of the platform that gives you a preview of what is your intention to draw on the screen, that gives you immediate warnings on the true change pane about anything that is going wrong. So you're not using this at all. You're not taking advantage of this pane here at all, because you're doing your own old school HTML programming. Don't use expressions as web development. Enjoy the true change. Enjoy the advantages that the platform gives you. The platform is flexible enough to allow you to do things your way. So if you really had to, you could do it the way we've just shown you on the previous slide, but you usually don't. The vast majority of the time, you're actually developing using the canvas and dragging things to their proper places. Do you know that Anonymous is the most famous role in apps and test screen is present in 45% of eSpaces? Remember to clean up after your development practices. Remember to set the proper roles on screens. Remember to remove test screens. You basically should be security aware in these things and cleaning up everything that's test related when you are moving things to QA and then to production. Uncheck the anonymous role from screens. And even develop your apps with seed data since the first one-click publish. Seed data is data that is as similar as possible as the actual data that you're going to use on the final production system. If at all possible, before starting development, copy your production database over to development so that during development, when you're dragging things from your data to your screens, the platform is showing you actual data that your users are going to see. And you can actually figure out very, very soon that some things won't work as you expect. If you try to create your own dummy data, you know what happens. Us developers, we are very aware of what may break in our code, and unwittingly, we create very conservative data and very conservative tests when we are testing our own applications. Using live data, and the best possible seed data is live data, actually a copy of the live data, is the best practice to ensure you are aware of information leakage and such security issues. Do locked doors lead to broken windows? Well, they tend to. As soon as you lock your door, the burglar gets through the windows into your home. So if you're locking things, you should think about locking all of them. And this means that if you're unchecking the anonymous role from your screens, remember your web services. Web services are providing data and information to third parties. You should also lock them up. Check who is accessing your web services. Provide some means of authentication so that only the proper consumers that you trust are able to use your own web services. One simple way to do this, assuming, for instance, that the OutSystems platform and is installed on a single environment, so you have the single environment with your web services and all consumers of your web service, is to set the web services producers as internal access only, and therefore only other systems on the same environment can consume the web services. That is just one idea. You can do this in many other simple ways. But remember to use the web services security settings and to validate who is accessing your web services. Security-wise, your web services are your windows. Once you lock your doors, remember to lock your windows. Now, this is a common cartoon that illustrates code injection problems. So here, school is calling mom. Hi, this is your son's school. We're having some computer trouble. Oh dear, did he break something? In a way. Did you really name your son Robert, close quote, close parenthesis, semicolon, drop table students, semicolon, dash dash? Oh yes, little Bobby Tables we call him. Well, we've lost this year's student records. I hope you're happy. And I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs. So this is an obvious example of how SQL injection happens. If somebody uses such a string on one of your forms, and you happen to use it with an expanding line yes parameter, and you forget the encode SQL function to make that string safe, then this is possible, it's real, it's possible, and can make you lose data permanently. So be very careful, this is very real, and you should really use encode SQL if you need it on an expanding line yes parameters. Customer will need this, I'm sure. Now this is an example of an advanced SQL, a SQL node, that has an output structure containing tons and tons of sources of information. And your select is selecting data from all those entities which will be joined together. Because the customer will need this, I'm sure. So I'm sure that eventually we are going to access the resource and some contact. And I really don't like SQL, so I'm just putting this all together while I'm thinking about it, and it works, and that's fine. Don't do that, of course. Performance-wise, it is awful. Define the output structure as needed. It's very, very simple to define one, and you can add further entities to your from clause as you need it in the SQL. This makes for a much faster performance in your advanced SQL nodes. Going for the records carousel. Now we've seen this previously on the previous slide set. And this is, of course, the bad way to do things. The records carousel would be aggregates followed by a for each loop to perform an update or delete of mass records. So this would be the idea. You use an aggregate to find which are the records you want to update. You iterate each one, changing the things you want to change. You use the built-in action update case, and you repeat the process. So multiple update statements, update SQL statements are being sent to the server rather than a single advanced SQL query. And that is the best practice. Use SQL queries for update, delete, max records. Who needs 10 records if I can get a million? So this is the same recommendation we've seen previously about max records. If you don't set max records, the database is trying to give you all the records that you want, and that may be a very large record set. If you know you're only looking at the first one for some reason, or the first few, write here how many you need. Say for instance your code needs to figure out if there is only one record, and if so, what is that record, or if there's more than one record. So you need to access the list.count or list.length. If you're doing that, actually, you only need to set max records to 2. You don't need the entire actual real length, because your code is going to check if length is greater than 1, and 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever is greater than 1. And if it's not, it's going to read the first result. So this is another example of how you can really limit your code and your max records to the absolute minimum for database performance. Use max records in aggregates, but so that you can watch out for your view state. So if you're using data from the aggregates on a separate screen action, like I've explained previously, that data needs to travel in your view state, and this is yet another reason why you don't want that to happen. You may only be using the first row, but because your aggregate returns 1,000 rows, all those 1,000 rows are traveling in your view state. That page is going to be terribly slow. Searching for always the same. Again, this is the same recommendation as previously with regards to indexing your entities. And if your conditions on a SQL query are typically, this is a screenshot actually of an old simple query widget, which no longer exists. So on an aggregate, you'd have a filter here. If you're always searching for something this similar to this, so using 2 separate fields, and this query occurs with some frequency, then you should actually have an index, which is a compound index that includes this attribute and this attribute together. And this would make for a much faster run of this kind of query. So use compound entity indexes whenever necessary. I've just searched for that. Now this is a quick screenshot that merely tries to illustrate how you may want to use session variables per screen. Now why is that? Now we're here in our to-dos screen. If we navigate to our to-do screen and do a search looking for a specific user or category, we hit search and we find 3 rows. Great. And now we want to know the details, so we click on one of them and this moves us to the to-do detail information. Now this to-do detail then gives us some information about that specific entry. We're on this specific screen here. We hit save or cancel, whatever, to go back to the previous screen. And when we're back, maybe because we didn't find what we needed, there were 3 different results, we were trying to see on the details which is the one that we want. When you go back, what do you expect to see here? The same 3 results, correct? This is likely true. You'd expect to see the same 3 results. So here you'd expect the search to still be here. This means that this needs to be on a session variable. And actually this screen was scaffolded, and if you take a look at how it was built by the platform, it's actually using a session variable, to-dos search keyword 3. And if you go over to session, of course, you do have your to-dos search keyword 3. This means that If you leave the screen and then come back eventually, because the data associated with this input is on the session variable, whatever was there, written there when you left, is still there. You can easily clean the search by using the reset button. This also means that this is the variable that you need to use on your aggregate to filter the results. So let's go over to the preparation, open our aggregate, and if we see our filters, yes, obviously, our filter is using our session variable, as you can see here. So this is the best practice. Use session variables per screen so that the screen keeps its state as the user navigates throughout the application. There can be exceptions to this on some occasions in terms of usability. Maybe the user expects the screen to be reset when he comes back. You should understand that and use your best guess, your intuition on a case-by-case basis to make the best use of this feature. Now, instead of a list of all records, why don't we have something more intelligent? Say here we have a list of a calendar with events, and we're able to select the year that we're trying to take a look at. But sometimes we want something smarter. Say, for instance, that in your search, rather than selecting the year, you're more interested in something like this: current year, closed years, and all years. So you can use a drop-down widget with these special list values, 0, 1, and 2. And then in your query condition, you'd place the condition for 0. So if this is this and this is that, and year filter equals, this is a bug, it's 0. Or another condition, and year filter equals 1. Or year filter equals 2. So you can specify in your condition multiple internal conditions which will actually be activated, so to speak, depending on your year filter variable, which is associated with this drop-down. You should use a smart filter criteria in aggregates. This is a usability thing to make your screens easier to use by your fellow colleagues, your users. Eventually, you also need to pay attention to your layout. Hopefully, you have some designers in your team. If you don't, you should take a look at some basic layout techniques. And these are the bad practices. Here you have lack of contrast. All of this text almost looks like the exact same thing, so you have everything pretty much with the same contrast. Nothing stands out, even though you do have a big title and then subtitles for each paragraph. Here you have no repetition. So again, you have the same 4 paragraphs, each one with a different style, and this really just creates confusion for your users. Here you have the wrong alignments. One aligned at this vertical location, now these 2 are behind it, now these are aligned, but this one is indented. This is all on the wrong spot. It's very difficult, or a bit more difficult to follow when a user is trying to figure out where to look at to find his stuff, to find the thing that he's interested in. Things should be pretty aligned so that they're easy to find as expected. And then you have bad positioning. Here the titles are so much apart, they have such a large margin underneath them that they don't look to be related to their paragraph. In fact, the bottom titles are closer to the top paragraphs and almost seem related to them. So this is bad positioning. It doesn't create a sense of belonging of titles and content. Now there's actually another rule that's actually missing here. The first one should be an S. These are the scrap design rules, and you would have contrast that should belong on any good design. Elements that aren't the same should be very different so that they stand out. Repetition, repeat style down the page for a cohesive feel. Alignment, everything on the page needs to be visually connected to something else. Positioning, proximity creates related meaning. And these are basic design principles. So to end, these top 10, more or less, they're actually 14, topics that we've talked about are: don't abuse on modularization. Encapsulate aggregates used in user actions after 3 strikes. Reminders must explain who, when, why. Don't use expressions as web development. Uncheck the anonymous role from screens. Use web services security settings. Use encode SQL. Define the output structure as needed in SQL nodes. Use advanced SQL queries for update-delete max records. Use max records in aggregates when not associated to list table records. Use compound entity indexes. Use session variables per screen. Use smart filter criteria in aggregates. And use the scrap design rules. Common pitfalls. Now, the first common pitfall is to create circular references in your modules. Even though it's not completely explained on this screenshot, if your module A has a dependency on something on module B, and vice versa, module B has a dependency on something on module A, then you have a circular reference. Now, this is a bad thing, not because anything breaks. You can still make your modules work, but because you never seem to get rid of your warnings in the true change pane. Now, why is that? Well, say you need to do some changes here, you make the changes, you publish, and obviously this module is now not up to date. And you get a warning on both. This one also tells you there is a consumer that is not up to date. So you open this one here, you open the dependencies window, you refresh all dependencies, even if actually the interface, the dependencies list of actions and their parameters and their data types doesn't change at all, you still need to refresh it because it's been changed. And after you refresh it, you publish it. But now, because the entire module has been published and is therefore different, you again have the same problem. This one says that there is a consumer that is not up to date. And as you can see, you never finish to try to fix this. You open this to refresh, you open this to refresh, and so on, and you can't leave this issue. So how do you fix that? Again, this isn't completely clear here, but what you do is you create a third module where you place the common items that are being exposed here and here. You place them on a third module, and then of course module A consumes C and module B consumes C. They are no longer circular references, and you fix your problem. Assign list expression to query. Now here we have a show widget, form show widget, and on the expressions in the form show widget, instead of reading data from that widget, you're actually reading data from the aggregate, get candidates. This is a very common mistake. Now this happens for any widget that behaves this way, all form widgets, and of course table records and similar widgets. So I have here a table records, and the table records is called to-do-table and gets its data from get to-dos. Now on my expressions, I should always use the table records. So this is to-do-table and this is correct. But it's very easy while developing to come over here, forget about that, and open the preparation, get to-dos, and you use one of these. And this is the wrong thing to use. It's very easy to break. You will likely have this expression with the same value throughout all lines of your table, because you're actually reading the aggregate which the to-dos widget has initially iterated, and is therefore now currently stopped at a specific row, usually the last row, and so you're always displaying the same value. So this is a common pitfall. The correct way would be to use of course, the widget's name, dot, and then, of course, read the proper information from within it. Binary loaded on preparation. Now, if you load a binary on your preparation, such as is here the case, you have your aggregate. This is actually an old simple query screenshot, but the idea is the same. If you have your aggregate that reads a CV, here you have the CV entity that has the binary data for that CV, for that curriculum or resume, if you prefer, for a specific candidate. And now you're trying to use this on a screen action to download the CV, then you have a problem because the CV needs to travel in the view state, making your page extremely slow. So what is the solution? There are actually currently two solutions to this. The best one is don't place the CV on the preparation at all. It makes that query run slower. And of course, it makes your page slightly slower to load. So avoid placing the CV on that page at all. And of course, the download button should then have its own aggregate to fetch the CV at that time and to then allow it to download. The other option is to have a refresh query here, or here actually, before the actual remainder of your action that allows the CV to be downloaded. This means that the data doesn't need to travel on the view state because it's being refreshed on this specific screen action. But it's a bad practice to have a large preparation that fetches way too much data. It usually makes your preparation much slower, and it could even cause the view state to show up, to need to be there, and of course to make your screens much slower. Another pitfall is to assign an empty record to clean it. Now, let's take a look at this example. We have here an action called clean record list. Let's first forget that we have a record list, and let's assume we have just a record. So if this is a clean record that has as input a candidate record and a local variable called clean candidate record, well, if this is a local variable and you never assign anything to it, then by default the values that are here are the clean values. What is that? Well, this means that all numbers are 0, booleans are false, text strings are empty, and so forth. That's what clean means. So in order to clean your input variable, if you ever need it within this action, this is the best practice. You create a local variable that you never assign anything to, and it's therefore always clean. And when you want to clean the input parameter, you simply copy this one over this one here, thereby replacing all of its values by clean values. Now, if we do have a record list rather than a record, that doesn't work, because lists, as well as some other data types, and you should read the documentation of the platform to understand which ones exactly, are copied by reference, which means that when you try to copy this one over this one, they actually both become the same. And as soon as you start assigning values to this one here, the one in the bottom also changes. So when you next try to clean something, you're actually not cleaning it. So this won't work. So how do we clean a record list? Well, it's very simple. There is now a new list clear action built into the platform which you can use. It takes a single argument, which is the record list that you want to clear, and it clears it, making it an empty list. It's that simple. Heavy timers, a tale of asynchronous processing, based on a true story. Now, what is a timer? A timer is a background process that is executed asynchronously. That means that it's not triggered by user action in this case. It's useful to perform routine tasks, such as sending emails at predetermined time, or to perform bootstrap logic after the application is published. It's also used to process large chunks of information and to offload heavy processing. Now, what does this mean? In this particular case, we're talking about usability. If you have some process that needs to chew, so to speak, on large amounts of data and takes a long time to finish, many minutes, actually even a minute would be way too much, or even days, you should offload it to a timer. The idea is that when a user pushes a button to start that process, he shouldn't have to wait those minutes or days before having the application responsive so that he can do other things with it. For instance, when you start backing up your computer, that is something that happens in the background. You don't push a button to back up your computer and then wait hours for it to finish. Now let's just take a quick look at how does this look like in the platform. You have here the Processes tab. You have here the Timers folder, and you just right-click, Add Timer, and you have your name, your timer name. Now, of course, you can select an action for this timer, but this is the most important property, the schedule. When I double-click on this, it shows me a lot of options. Now, most of them are time-based. The timer will run daily, weekly, on a specific day of month, on a weekday of month, or when published. This is what is automatically created when you try and bootstrap some entity via an Excel. If you come over to this tab, you'll see that the timer is automatically created here to bootstrap your data when the module is published. So this is a timer. Let's take a look at the example and a real case of using timers to offload heavy processing. There was this big telecom company that was a customer of ours that wanted to use the SMS campaigns system. So it wanted to generate SMSs for customers. So it prepares the messages for each customer. It might adapt each one for each customer. Then there's some processing here. The SMSs are being sent over the GSM network. The evolution is being logged on a specific database. And then you have here the back office that reads data from this log database and shows you what was the result from this campaign. Now, this kind of diagram is not the same as an action diagram. These aren't nodes or statements. This is just a basic idea of how the work progresses from one part of the system to the next. So obviously, there is no flow that connects an entity to a screen. In fact, in reality, well, you could have an aggregate falling onto a screen redirect, but this is not what I mean. What I mean is that you are processing things here, then this happens. This happens at the same time as it logs here, so this is a basic idea of where the work is flowing, and this is being used as the source of data for this screen. Now, while developing, this was a nice idea, but as soon as we started to run this, we had an issue. There was a huge SMS queue and too much processing and logging time. This was done synchronously. So the customer pushed the button, and while in development you were using 3 or 4 SMS phone numbers, and this worked fine. There were a few seconds to send them. As soon as you put this in the hands of a telecom customer, they have several tens or hundreds of thousands or more customers that need to be addressed, and suddenly this takes many minutes, hours, or days to finish. So this didn't work. The first solution, of course, is to make this asynchronous, and we use timers. So now the idea is to have the preparation of the SMSs here. We store that preparation on a temporary table or entity, which we call the raw entity. This has the raw data that is already ready for sending. And now we trigger a timer, hence this symbol here. The timer will send each SMS in the background, and while it does that, it logs the result or failure of each thing being sent in the logs entity. Of course, the back office can access this information, and the user should keep refreshing, or there should be some automatic refreshing so that the back office keeps showing you how is this progressing in the background. Now this solved the problem of the user having to wait and having a spinning beach ball on the Mac or the hourglass on Windows while waiting for the page to load after he pushed the button to send the SMSs. But we had another problem. The timer timed out. And why is that? Well, there is something associated with a timer, which is a timeout in minutes. This is another property. By default, the timer has a 20-minute timeout. But if the timeout is here, why don't we just do this? It's very easy. Well, yes, you can do that, but it's a bad practice. The issue here is that if you increase this randomly to a large number, you forego on some of the advantages of advanced warnings in case there is something wrong with your timer. Say, for instance, you had a bug in your timer, you made some changes, and you had a bug in your timer, and there's an infinite loop there, and nothing happens. If your timeout is 2000 seconds, it will take you 2000 seconds before the timer is killed and a log is sent to Service Center saying that the timer was killed due to timeout. So it takes you 2000 minutes before you realize you have a problem, let alone fix it. If instead you have a 20-minute timeout, it's much shorter. You are warned of potential issues much sooner. So this is one of the advantages of keeping timeouts short. Now, of course, you have the option to increase this, but it's a best practice to keep it short. And we'll show you in this masterclass how to make things work even though the timeout is short. So what are the best practices for building timers? Well, the timer should never time out, obviously. That means that the process is killed and it's recalled a second time on a second attempt. Now, if it never times out and we want to keep that 20-minute or shorter timeout, how do we make something that takes days to finish work? Obviously, very simple. We do it in chunks, in pieces. We do the first piece for 10 minutes, the second piece for another 10 minutes, the third piece for another 10 minutes, and so on. We split our work into multiple pieces. And every time we're doing a piece, we need to follow all these rules. The timer must never time out. We need to be sure that what we're doing fits onto that minimum timeout that we've set on the platform for that timer. Then, because we are calling our timer time and time again to continue to do its work, we need to be sure that the formula, so to speak, the algorithm that we're using doesn't repeat work when it's being called time and time again. Say, for instance, that a long-running timer that had a timeout of 2000 minutes was running, and there was a power failure on the server. When the server comes up again, it reruns that timer because it hadn't finished. If you don't do this, you don't pay attention to be sure that the timer doesn't repeat work, then the timer will repeat, in this case sending SMSs to thousands of people all over again. And those will not be happy customers. The algorithm should also ensure completeness. That is, when it's being called time and time again, eventually it will reach the end. So it's not an infinite loop. And finally, it ensures data integrity, so that if there is a power failure, there is an absolute minimum amount of data that is lost and a minimum amount of corruption, so to speak, in terms of how the process works. So in our example, at most, one single user would get a duplicated message in case of system failure when the system comes back up. So these are the best practices for building timers. So how do we solve the problem that we had, which is the timer timed out? Well, this is the algorithm, and we're going to take a look at it in detail. So we start here, and the idea, of course, is to run for only a short time. So initially, we measure the current time and date, and we add 10 minutes to it. And we store this locally on a local variable. This will be our soft timeout, which we'll check later on to see if we reached it. So if we add 10 minutes to our soft timeout, remember that the hard timeout, the timeout that is set on the Service Studio platform itself, should be larger, for instance 20 minutes. Now, you set this initially, and now you start the process. So you use an aggregate to fetch some records to process. Now, how many is some? Well, 100 or 1,000 are usually good numbers, but you really should measure this on your own use case. If what you're doing is actually a process that is very short, but you're processing millions or billions of records, then of course you can increase this significantly. However, do remember that while you're doing this, if it's a slow process, the database internally may have all those records in memory waiting to be sent over to you. So it really depends on how you want to measure things, but 100 or 1,000 are usually good numbers. On the other hand, if the process that you're doing on each row, on each record is very slow, then maybe only 10 or 5 are good numbers to be doable in 10 minutes. You then iterate each result row, and you repeat for each cycle whatever you need to do. You do something, and you update that row on a specific flag. You should need to have an attribute there that says whether this has been processed or this has not yet been processed. You update that flag to signal that it has been processed. You do that using a SQL, advanced SQL, so this is as fast as possible, so that you don't need to use an assign before an update action. And now you commit transaction. The commit transaction ensures that the things that you did here are now written on the database. So this ensures that the database has an updated row. This ensures, let me go back one slide, data integrity. Now, after you've done this, you want to repeat, but before you repeat, has the timeout passed? So you check, you compare the time and date that you stored, that was 10 minutes in the future, with the current time and date. And has this timeout passed when you compare this? If it hasn't, you go back to for each and you repeat this process. Okay? And because you're checking the timeout after doing at least one of these things that you need to do, let me go back, you are ensuring completeness. Your timer does at least one of the things that it wants to do before trying to launch itself again, so it's never an infinite loop. Also, because you have updated the processed flag, and your aggregate should filter out all those rows that have the processed flag set to yes, it's already processed, you are ensuring that the timer does not repeat work. So with this small algorithm that we've seen so far, we are sure that everything is being processed. There is only one small thing we need to take a look at, which is this only gets 100 or 1,000 records. There may be more. So when the for each finishes, it goes through here and we have another condition. Are there more records to process? If there are, we go back to our aggregate and repeat everything until eventually we time out. If they're not, we end. Now, the way we figure out that there are more records can be many different things. We can use the count property of the aggregate to figure out if the entire set, original set of records that it's in the database, regardless of the max records that we've used here to fetch the records that we want to process, is bigger than the ones we have here. Or we always repeat this and we check here in the middle if there's 0 records fetched by the aggregate, which is another solution. So it really depends on how you want to figure this out in your own code and what exactly is your problem that you're trying to solve. So again, we iterate everything, we fetch all the rows, we iterate all the rows doing what we need to do, and if the timeout hasn't passed, we repeat, and then we eventually check if we need to process more records. If we do, we fetch more records. If we do not, we finish. So the timer ends and that's it. It's no longer running. If on the contrary, the timeout has passed, if it's true, then what we do is wake ourselves up. This is an action that wakes the timer. And the idea is to wake the exact same timer. We wake ourselves up and then we end. What does this mean? Well, in this arrow, during this very short period between the wake timer and the end, if there are enough front-end servers to support multiple running timers, there may be 2 separate iterations of this timer running at the same time. But one of them is actually just going in this direction and then finishing, dying off. So there's no interference from one iteration to the next. The other timer that's woken will get a brand new timeout of 20 minutes. So we've just, so to speak, reset our timeout allowance when we did this. The other timer here, when it wakes up, begins at this point and goes on doing all that it needs to do. And this is basically how you solve heavy timers. So, when we applied this to our problem, we now had fixed the issue. Multiple SMSs were being generated, the data is stored on a raw entity, then the timer is launching itself in 10 minutes chunks, doing its processing, recording its progress in a logs entity, and the back office reads the logs entity to find out how are things going. This runs again in 10 minutes chunks, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, until it reaches the end of all SMSs that need to be sent. If in the meantime the user pushes this button again for another SMS campaign, more data is added here, and this simply keeps on going and finishes processing the first lot and goes on to the second lot without ever stopping. So this works fine as a heavy processing in the background. So company needs evolve, and now the company asks us to add email campaigns also to our processes. So we now have a similar system. So we generate all the emails, we store the raw data on a raw database. We have another timer that runs every 10 minutes to send the emails, and these both timers register the progress on the same logs database so that the same screen shows the evolution of how they are both progressing. And now we have a different problem. Because both timers are running at the same time, because there's more than one front-end server, they're both trying to write to the logs database, the logs entity, at the same time. So there is performance degradation and even timeouts due to locks. What do we do? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is to sequence timers. So instead of having them running at the same time, this one is running for 10 minutes until it ends. When it ends, rather than finishing completely, it moves on to the other timer, wakes up the other timer. And the other timer launches itself up time and time and time again until it finishes. And then this processing ends and finishes. Now the actual details, of course, are a tidbit more complex. Maybe after this one finishing, it also jumps back here. And either of them, when they jump from one to the next, they do not do so if they understand the corresponding raw database is empty, so that they both eventually stop running when there's nothing running at this time. Another detail that you have to pay attention to is that when you launch one of these, you also need to understand whether any of them are currently running. And if they are, you don't launch them, you don't wake any timer, you just let them keep on running. Which means that there needs to be some information as to a session variable, an entity somewhere that stores information on whether they are currently running. But once we do this, once we sequence timers, we now have no problems accessing our logs database. There's no longer concurrency because each of them is running independently. So again, our customer needs evolve, and they ask us to add website logging. So we just retrieve the access logs from the website. The raw data is exposed here. There's some processing to store it in the logs so that that is displayed in the back office as well. And the problem is that because the SMS is the slowest of these three, it was very common, and whenever there was an SMS campaign, that this would run for days or weeks, and these two would never begin. And actually this is very bad. Say a customer pays for an SMS campaign to be sent immediately, and it starts to be sent. Another customer pays for an email campaign, and unfortunately his campaign takes weeks to begin because there's lots of SMSs being processed. So long peaks on SMS campaigns cause starvation for email and website logs processing. How do we solve this? It's actually very simple because we do have our timers running for 10-minute chunks. We simply round robin them. The idea is here at the bottom. You run the first timer for 10 minutes, and rather than waking itself up for the next 10 minutes, it wakes the second timer that runs for 10 minutes. And then when this one finishes that chunk, that piece of 10 minutes, it runs this third timer. And the third one goes back and runs the first. So this one runs for 10 minutes, then 10 minutes here, then 10 minutes here, then 10 minutes here, and so on. A bit like multitasking happens on current CPUs on modern operating systems, even if you have a single core. This is how CPUs pretend they can run multiple things at once. So now we have solved the problem. By round robbing these processes, there's no longer starvation. They all run apparently at the same time, and everything works as is possible within each one's realm. But as the logs database is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, inserting new records there is getting slower and slower and slower. So how do we solve this now? Well, truth is that when you look at the back office, you really don't care about data that is a month old, a year old, unless for very rare occasions. So why don't we move all data here to an archive entity? And that is actually the solution. There is an archive entity. We add a fourth timer process that archives old log entries here, because each of them runs after the other. None of these run at the same time as another process. This is an atomic operation and works fine. So it selects multiple rows, it inserts them here, and then deletes them here. Even though these are two processes, inserting and deleting here. For all intents and purposes, this is atomic from the point of view of all of these guys, as they are not running when this one is. Of course, if you want the back office to be able to access the archive entity, you need to change the back office screen now, either by having an explicit user interface that selects which entity is being used to search, or by automatically understanding the rule that's being used here. So say that the rule here is that every log entry older than a month is moved here, then the back office can use the same rule. If we're trying to search for records which are older than a month, or when the user is using pagination and now it's moving behind a month old, it automatically switches to searching for that data here. That's another option. And this solves the problem, but it can be even better. According to common database practice and performance recommendations, which is applicable to any database, not only on the OutSystems platform, if you have this kind of problems of large entities, large tables in your database, you can have better performance if you split these large tables onto a separate database catalog. And the OutSystems platform supports this. There is the multiple catalog support. You can configure this in Service Center, and then you decide every module that you publish from then on. You have Service Studio, as soon as you publish, ask you which catalog will I create these entities on. And if you make those entities public, you can then have another module read data from both here and here. And if you use, therefore, multiple database catalogs, this solution is even better. It's a feature that is right there in the OutSystems platform. And finally, this solves this huge problem of massive amounts of data and processing that our customer had. However, any system that deals with massive amounts of data is never finished. You always need to tinker and find solutions for the next thing that is clogging your processing. And that is left over to your particular skills and your problem set and your own use case. Well, this is it for this masterclass, and I thank you for joining me.